The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song at Sacred Heart Hospital, a sound Margaret Walsh had stopped noticing somewhere around year 7. Now, in year 18, the hum was just part of the silence she carried with her, the kind of silence that comes from knowing too much and being allowed to say nothing. Silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it pulled at her temples. Orthopedic shoes worn thin on the left heel where she favored that side, a limp so practiced that most people saw a tired nurse approaching retirement and looked away. They didn't see the way her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd performed surgery in a sandstorm. They didn't see the 23 surgical teams she'd run through 8 field deployments. They didn't see the woman who'd held 3 Marines together with duct tape and muscle memory while mortars fell like hail on a tin roof. The night shift at Sacred Heart ICU. 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Margaret began her rounds at bed 1, checking the cardiac monitor of a 67-year-old with a new stent, her fingers confirming what the machines were already screaming into the dark room: normal sinus rhythm, strong, steady, alive. She moved to bed 2. Bed 3. Her movements economical, never wasted, the way someone moves when they've learned that energy is currency and survival is about balance. In the supply closet at 10:06 p.m., before shift change, before the patients really needed her, she kept a cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded yellow letters. The succulent beside it had stopped growing 3 weeks ago but still drew water from her twice a week, Tuesday and Friday, the way some people keep a grave. The ceramic was cool against her palm when she held it. One small anchor in a world that had decided she no longer existed. At 11 p.m., orderlies rolled through the trauma bay doors pushing a stretcher. Margaret was at the nurse's station updating charts when she heard the dispatch chatter: male, 44, multiple blunt force trauma, training accident on base, conscious on scene, now altered. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The routine was always the same: admit, assess, stabilize, watch, and eventually either hold their hand as they left or hold their family together when they didn't. The stretcher came through the double doors and turned toward ICU Bay 4. Margaret's pen stopped moving. The name came through the radio before the patient did. Commander James Rourke. USMC. 2 tours, 3rd rotation pending. Injury sustained during a controlled demolition exercise that went sideways. Her hand went absolutely still. She set the pen down with precision, waiting 2 seconds, then 3, for her breathing to reset. The body knows what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Muscle memory doesn't distinguish between a surgeon's hands and a mother's. Both react before permission arrives. Margaret stood and moved toward the bay with the same unhurried pace she'd used for 6,574 days. No one accelerated in a hospital unless something was ending. The stretcher was being transferred to the bed when she stepped into the room, white sheets being tucked with practice speed, the ventilator already in place, providing oxygen at a rate that meant he'd been struggling at the scene. His face was obscured by the breathing tube, but his build, his shoulders, the faint scar that ran along his jaw, she knew this man. She'd met him once, 14 months ago, in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon that had destroyed everything. David had brought him home in dress blues. His commanding officer. The one who'd written the letter explaining that her son had died saving 3 other Marines when an IED detonated in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The one who'd ordered the op. The one who'd signed the condolence letter in the kind of careful script that suggested he'd written it 100 times before. Commander James Rourke. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't exhaustion playing tricks. The universe had a mechanism for balance, apparently, and it operated on a schedule only the gods understood. Margaret's voice came out. Steady. Get me his belongings. Full inventory. No question, no please. The charge nurse glanced at her, hesitated for 1.2 seconds, then nodded and moved. Margaret didn't wait for the bag. She was already accessing his chart on the computer at the station, her eye scanning for the details that would explain how David's commanding officer had ended up on her ICU floor. High-impact collision during a demolition sequence. Blunt force trauma to the chest, left side. Pneumothorax developing. Possible rib fractures, at least 6, the radiologist had counted. He'd been unconscious for 47 minutes at the scene. The fact that he was breathing at all meant someone had stabilized him fast. The fact that he was here meant someone had made a choice. Margaret scrolled past the medical details to the personal effects inventory and found what she already knew would be there: wallet, phone, military ID, and one dog tag on a broken chain. She stood and walked to the secured belongings closet without letting her hand touch anything else. The ICU nurse, Rebecca, was already pulling the clear plastic bag. New admission. Commander Rourke. Bay 4. Margaret took the bag and carried it to the medication room, a space where the cameras had a blind spot if you stood in the right corner, something she'd learned in her first month here by accident and never acknowledged deliberately. She opened the bag. The dog tag caught the fluorescent light like a mirror, and for a moment the hum of the machines faded into something else: a memory of rain on a forward operating base, a voice on the phone that had called her to a military hospital because her son wouldn't be coming home, and the weight of a small metal rectangle that had survived her son's body had not. The name was stamped in sharp military block letters: Walsh, David. SN 2847956. Blood type O positive. Religion Protestant. And then his unit, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. She held the tag for exactly 2 seconds, the only private moment she would allow herself in this room, in this hospital, in this entire reconstruction of a life that had been ordered, officially and in writing, to disappear. Then she tucked it into her scrubs pocket, where it settled against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The metal was warm from sitting in the plastic bag. Or maybe she was just that cold. The sound of footsteps on linoleum came before the voice. Dr. Caldwell. She recognized his walk, the kind of stride that suggested he'd never been questioned and didn't plan to start. Margaret was still holding the belongings bag, and she set it down on the medication counter with deliberate care, her movement slowing to normal speed, her face already arranged into the expression of a nurse simply doing inventory. He came around the corner at 11:14 p.m., and his eyes tracked from the bag to her hand to her scrubs pocket in the span of a heartbeat. His face didn't change. That was the dangerous part, not anger, not contempt, but the cold calculation of someone watching a chess piece move into a square they hadn't anticipated. Checking medications. His voice had the texture of someone accustomed to being believed. New admission. Personal effects. Margaret's words were clipped, efficient. Need to document the chain. Caldwell stepped closer and looked at the bag, then at her scrubs pocket where the outline of the dog tag pressed slightly against the fabric. Seems thorough. There was something underneath the words, a tone that suggested he'd seen something she didn't know she'd revealed. Margaret set the bag down and turned to face him directly, her eyes meeting his with the steadiness of someone who'd made harder decisions than whatever this moment required. Standard protocol. She waited, the weight of the dog tag a physical thing against her chest. Caldwell smiled. It wasn't warmth. Of course it is. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, but the message was already hanging in the fluorescent-lit silence between them, clear as equipment failure. He'd seen the dog tag. He'd seen her hand slip it into her scrubs. And he'd filed it away in a corner of his mind where it would eventually become useful leverage. Margaret stood in the medication room for 47 more seconds. Her hand was still steady. Her breathing was still even. She'd survived worse than this, worse interrogations, worse losses, worse choices. But something in her recognized, in that moment, that the quiet life she'd built was beginning to unravel at the edges, and there was nothing she could do but watch the threads pull free one by one. She walked back to Bay 4 where Commander Rourke was breathing in measured intervals, his chest rising and falling on the rhythm of machines, and she checked his full line with the same precision she'd used 1,000 times before. The dog tag ticked against her ribs like a clock counting down to something neither of them could see yet. The night shift had 11 hours remaining. The hospital hummed. The machines beeped. And somewhere in the building, Dr. Caldwell was already thinking about how to use what he'd just learned. The corner of the nurse's station felt smaller when Dr. Caldwell approached. Margaret was updating Rourke's chart, routine vitals, medication times, nothing that warranted the weight of his attention. He leaned against the counter, his tailored shirt pristine despite the 6 a.m. hour, and lowered his voice just enough that the day shift trickling in would have to lean closer to listen. "Interesting that you're so invested in Commander Rourke's case," he said. "Not a question. An accusation wrapped in casual observation. Checking on him every 2 hours. Reviewing his intake paperwork. Making sure he gets the best care, or just curious about military men." Margaret's pen didn't pause. She finished the notation, heart rate 78, regular rhythm, BP stable, before she looked at him. "Just doing my job, Doctor." He smiled. That smile was a shark showing its teeth before the bite. "Of course. Grandma Maggie always does her job." The nickname landed like a slap across her face, but not the kind that left a mark. This kind of hit was designed to echo. 2 nurses at the adjacent desk glanced away simultaneously, the kind of synchronized movement that only happened when people were embarrassed for someone else. Or embarrassed to be in the same room. Margaret closed the chart with a soft click and set the pen down with the precision of someone placing a bomb. She didn't look up again. Looking up would have meant acknowledging that the words had reached her. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing didn't change. But she filed the moment away the way soldiers file away the faces of people who've just tried to break them. Caldwell walked away satisfied. He'd drawn first blood without raising his voice. By 2 p.m., the overhead intercom crackled to life. Margaret was on the geriatric floor, changing linens on room for 12, when the speaker emitted that particular metallic screech that meant hospital-wide announcement. "Grandma Maggie to the supply closet. Grandma Maggie to the supply closet." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had weight. A nurse's aide in the hallway pressed her lips together, studying her shoes. An elderly patient in 410 coughed quietly, uncertain. Margaret felt every eye in the vicinity tracking her, waiting to see how she would respond. She set down the fitted sheet she'd been holding and moved toward the stairwell with her uneven gait, the limp that came from standing for 18 years on feet that had carried her through 3 combat tours, 2 of them in Ramadi where the dust got into everything and never quite left. The supply closet was on the 3rd floor, tucked behind the pharmacy. When Margaret opened the door, Dr. Caldwell was already waiting, arms crossed, positioned with the casual authority of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. The fluorescent strip light overhead cast him in a yellowish pallor that made his expression look carved from marble. "You've been accessing Rourke's service records," he said before she'd even closed the door. His voice had changed. This wasn't the casual predator from the nurse's station. This was something sharper. Asking questions about Ramadi deployments. Why? Margaret took one measured breath. The air in the supply closet smelled like industrial cleaner and cardboard, the smell of a place where nothing lived, only things were stored and forgotten. She met his eyes and held them the way you hold a live wire, with full knowledge of the voltage. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, without changing her expression. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it. "Threatening me won't change what you've done, Doctor." His face hardened. His jaw clenched at an angle that suggested he'd been expecting her to shout, to cry, to fold. Instead, she'd handed him a sentence so calm it sounded like a promise. Like someone describing an inevitable event. "What I've done. You're a per diem nurse with delusions." His voice dropped another octave, the sound of a tank idling in a garage. "Let me show you what I can do." The third humiliation came at 3:27 p.m. during shift change. The rain had started an hour earlier, the kind of Philadelphia autumn rain that soaked through cotton and made the parking lot smell like wet asphalt and diesel fuel. Margaret was walking toward her car, a 2008 Honda Civic with 247,000 miles and a rattling engine that had somehow outlasted 2 relationships and 3 different jobs, when Caldwell appeared beside the attending physician and the shift supervisor. 17 nurses were arriving for the evening shift, umbrellas blooming like mushrooms across the concrete. "Margaret, effective immediately, you're being moved to per diem status." Caldwell's voice carried. It was meant to carry. Budget cuts. He handed her a single sheet of paper. The letterhead read, Sacred Heart Hospital, Human Resources Department. The words blurred slightly, but she caught the essentials: position changed, hours reduced, effective retroactive to her last shift, contingent upon further review. His smirk didn't waver. It was the smirk of someone who'd just moved a chess piece and wanted to watch her realize what he'd taken. Margaret took the paper. She nodded once. Not a nod of acceptance, a nod of acknowledgement. There was a difference. She turned and walked to her car as the rain hammered down, soaking through her thin hospital jacket, matting her silver hair against her neck. She could feel their eyes on her back. Caldwell's. The supervisors. The 17 nurses who'd just watched her get dismantled in real time. She didn't look back. That night, after work, Margaret went to her apartment, a one-bedroom in northeast Philadelphia with hardwood floors that creaked and a window that faced a brick wall. She made tea she didn't drink and sat at her kitchen table with a cardboard box of letters. David's letters. Each one was dated, organized by deployment, preserved with the kind of care that only a mother could manage. She found the one she was looking for, postmarked Ramadi, March 2009, and read it again, though she'd memorized it 3 years ago. Margaret made a photocopy at the 24-hour pharmacy 4 blocks away. She made 3 copies, actually. One she carried with her. One she hid in her locker at Sacred Heart. One she placed in a sealed envelope and addressed to her attorney, with instructions to open it only if something happened to her. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd learned long ago that documentation was survival. The next morning, Caldwell made 3 phone calls from his private office on the 4th floor. Margaret didn't know about them yet, but she would. The universe had a way of announcing its cruelties eventually. First call, to the hospital board. Margaret Walsh is showing signs of mental instability. Boundary violations with a patient. She's becoming a liability. Second call, to human resources. Build a termination file. Practicing beyond her scope of nursing. Insubordination. Access to patient records she shouldn't have authority for. I can provide documentation. Third call, to a contact at the Veterans Administration. The voice on the other end was cautious at first, then understanding, then complicit. If anyone comes asking about a Major Margaret Walsh, discharge records, service history, anything, there's no record. Understood. Caldwell hung up and smiled at the wall of his office, where a photograph showed him accepting an award from the Defense Supply Management Agency. The awards for excellence in procurement. The contract's worth millions. The kickback arrangements he'd negotiated with 3 different manufacturers who'd agreed to supply substandard materials at premium prices, the difference flowing into accounts in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. By noon, Margaret found herself with a new assignment. The geriatric floor. New badge protocols meant she couldn't access the 4th floor ICU. New shift rotations meant she'd never work with Rourke's night nurses again. She'd been isolated with the precision of someone who understood institutional machinery the way a surgeon understands anatomy. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Rourke had information that could unravel everything: the contracts, the equipment failures, the 3 Marines who died in Ramadi because their chest seals didn't hold. The worst part was that Margaret held information too. The worst part was that neither of them could talk to each other anymore, and Caldwell had just made sure of it. The night shift fell across Sacred Heart like a hammer. Margaret clocked in at 11:53 p.m., her badge scanning with the soft click that had become the sound of her diminishment. The roster on the break room wall told her everything: her name removed from the ICU rotation, reassigned to the med-surg floors where she'd push medications for stable patients and pretend not to notice the clinical notes being buried in the digital system. 3 nurses had worked Rourke's wing yesterday. 2 today. Tonight, the slot beside his name read, Margaret Walsh, solo coverage, all 12 hours, minimal monitoring protocol. Caldwell had been surgical about it. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, her movements precise as a combat insertion. The other nurses who passed her offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They'd seen the demotion, heard the parking lot humiliation, understood the unspoken hierarchy that had shifted. When you're targeted by administration, the hospital staff pulls away like a fish school sensing a predator. Self-preservation. She didn't blame them. She recognized the survival instinct. By midnight, the hospital had settled into that particular silence that only night shifts produce, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in a pale, sterile glow, the distant beep of monitors creating a rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat. Margaret stood at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, where Rourke lay in a private room at the end of the north corridor. The monitors visible from her desk showed his vitals updating every 15 minutes. Stable. But something in those numbers felt off to her, the kind of wrong that a civilian nurse might miss, but a combat field surgeon read like a sniper reads wind. She sat down at the station computer. Moved her fingers across the keyboard. She hadn't accessed the classified medical record system in 4 years, not since the Pentagon's letter had arrived at her apartment ordering her to disappear. The password was muscle memory. Her old security clearance code, the one the military was supposed to have deactivated, was still nested in the system's database like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. She typed it in. 1 second of hesitation. Then she pressed enter. The system recognized her. Rourke's full chart opened. His real chart, not the sanitized version that appeared on the civilian monitors. CT imaging from admission showed a contusion extending across his right lateral chest wall, the impact fracturing ribs for through 7. The chest tube insertion site was clean at admission, but the imaging from 8 a.m. today showed something that made her jaw clench. The surgical line was beginning to separate. Dehiscence. The wound was starting to open from the inside out. His lungs were still inflating properly, still oxygenating, but the margin for error was narrowing. The next 48 hours would be critical. The monitoring protocol showed the problem clearly. Caldwell had ordered reduced observation, 1 nurse check every 4 hours instead of the standard hourly assessment for a trauma patient of this severity. A single nurse, alone, could miss a pneumothorax developing. Could miss the subtle signs of air entering the pleural space. By the time it became a full collapse, it would be catastrophic. Margaret printed nothing. Screenshots nothing. In this hospital, there was no such thing as a private action. But she committed the numbers to memory the way a sniper memorizes a range-finding wind correction. O2 sat 94%. Heart rate elevated at 104. Blood pressure trending downward across the shift, 138/81 at admission, now 126/76 at midnight. Slow bleed. Compensation breaking down. She sat back from the computer. Waited 30 seconds. Then she reached for the phone on the desk and called up to the charge nurse on the 5th floor. "This is Margaret," she said quietly. "I need the surgeon on call to do a chest wound reassessment for Commander Rourke in room 4112. The silence on the other end lasted 2 full seconds. "Margaret, you're not authorized to make clinical recommendations right now. You know that." The charge nurse's voice was apologetic but firm. "Your credential flags are. His wound is showing signs of dehiscence. I've seen it before. He needs. I'll let Dr. Caldwell know." A pause. "That's the protocol now." The line went dead. She tried the on-call surgeon next. The call went to voicemail. She tried paging with a clinical note. The system rejected it, credential restriction, unauthorized to submit clinical orders. Margaret hung up the phone with the kind of deliberate care a person uses to avoid smashing something. The trap had been constructed with perfect efficiency. Caldwell hadn't just isolated her from the patient. He disconnected her from the chain of command entirely. At 2 a.m., she was standing outside the ICU wing, watching Rourke's room through the observation window at the end of the hallway. She could see the gentle rise and fall of his chest beneath the hospital gown, the monitor's green line tracking his heartbeat in steady peaks. His face was turned toward the window, unaware, asleep, alive because people like her and people like the Marines in his unit had made choices that cost them everything. Footsteps approached from behind. The tread was confident, unhurried. She didn't need to turn around. "You're not authorized here, Margaret." Caldwell's voice was smooth as silk over broken glass. He dressed carefully, navy blazer, crisp white shirt, the kind of casual elegance that signaled someone who'd never scraped blood from under their fingernails. "I could have security remove you." She turned to face him. Her limp was more pronounced after 8 hours on her feet, her weight favoring the left side, but her eyes were level. "His chest wound needs attention. The incision line is showing early signs of separation. His vitals are being monitored by the approved protocol, which doesn't include your input." Caldwell's smile was a negotiation tactic, not genuine warmth. "He needs doctors, not a nurse playing detective. Go home. Surrender your badge at the security desk. Consider this your final warning, Margaret. The next time you attempt to make clinical decisions for a patient you're not assigned to, security will be escorting you off the property." She didn't argue. Argument would give him satisfaction. She turned and walked toward the elevator instead, her movements controlled, her face blank. Behind her, she heard him on his phone before the elevator doors had even closed, already making the calls that would ensure she had no way back. The drive home through the rain felt like moving through grief. Water hammered her windshield, and she didn't turn on the radio or think about anything except the number of hours left before Rourke's wound would reach the point of no return. 48 hours. Maybe less. Inside her apartment, she moved to the bedroom closet and reached behind the winter coats for a locked box made of brushed aluminum. It was the only thing she'd kept from her old life. The key was still in the same place, tucked behind a photograph on the nightstand, a picture of David in his dress blues, grinning at a future he would never see. The box opened with a quiet click. Inside lay her discharge papers, sealed with a classification stamp so dark it looked like it had been burned into the paper, * Major Margaret Walsh, Honorable Discharge, Medical Classification, sealed by Direct Order of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. * Beneath them, a velvet case containing 2 bronze stars and 1 silver star, the ribbon still pressed in their original creases. A letter dated 14 months ago, bearing the Pentagon letterhead and a signature from someone with a rank she no longer recognized. The signature belonged to a world she'd been ordered to forget. The letter was brief, * Major Walsh, you are hereby relieved of active duty status, all operational clearances are suspended, and you are forbidden from any further investigation into Operation Blackwater or the circumstances of your son's death. You will assume civilian status immediately. Disclosure of any classified information will result in federal prosecution. Failure to comply with this order is a violation of the Espionage Act. Acknowledge receipt and comply. *. She had acknowledged receipt. She had complied. She had taken the job at Sacred Heart Hospital under her own name, worn the scrubs, held the stethoscope, and never said a word about the 3 tours she'd done running combat surgical operations in Ramadi. She had let the truth stay buried with David. But seeing his dog tag around another Marine's neck had cracked something open inside her. Something that had been sealed for 14 months now demanded to be heard. At 5:13 a.m., Margaret walked into the hospital again. The security guard at the front entrance glanced up, recognition flickering across his face. "Morning, Margaret. You're early." "Double shift," she said, which was technically false. Her badge still worked, it would for another 8 hours before Caldwell had it deactivated remotely. She went through the metal detector, collected her belongings on the other side, and climbed the stairs toward the ICU. She didn't go to the break room. Didn't clock in. Instead, she walked directly to the observation window of room 4112 and looked at Commander James Rourke's chest as it rose and fell beneath the hospital-issue blanket. On the 3rd floor below, in his office, Caldwell sat behind his desk and watched the security camera feed on his monitor. He saw her standing there in defiance of his explicit order. His jaw tightened, and his hand moved to his telephone. "Security," he said quietly into the receiver. "We have a trespassing situation developing on the ICU. Stand by for apprehension." But Margaret was already moving. The alarm screamed at 6:24 a.m. Not the steady beep of a monitor drift. Not the soft chime of an for completion. This was the specific, urgent wail of a tension pneumothorax, a sound Margaret's hands recognized before her conscious mind caught up. She was 3 doors down, checking vitals on a post-op abdominal repair, when she heard it. The sound cut through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. She moved. The night nurse froze in Rourke's doorway, hand hovering over the call button. Margaret didn't run. Running was a luxury her left knee wouldn't permit, but she covered the distance in the way people move when they've already calculated the cost of hesitation. Her limp became a rhythm, not a disability. Rourke's chest wound had dehissed. Split open like a mouth screaming. Air was flooding his pleural cavity with each desperate breath he took, collapsing the lung, pushing his mediastinum sideways. His oxygen saturation was reading 64 and dropping. His lips already taking on that bluish tint that meant his blood was forgetting how to carry oxygen. "Step back," Margaret said to the frozen nurse. Not a request. Not even particularly loud. Just the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She reached for his personal effects bag, the one with his combat boots and a folded letter and the MRE package he'd been picking at since admission. Her fingers found the plastic pouch with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in sandstorm and darkness and the kind of fear that teaches you precision. She tore open the package. The metallic smell of vacuum-sealed food hit the air, a scent that belonged to forward operating bases and field hospitals and men trying to eat something before the next casualty roll. The occlusive dressing. That was what they called it in the textbooks. What they taught in nursing school for the theoretical trauma patient who would probably never arrive. Margaret had made dozens of them in Ramadi with materials that included duct tape and a plastic lining from water bottles and shrapnel-scarred hands that didn't shake. She positioned the plastic wrapper over the open wound. 3 sides. Tape on 3 sides. Leave one corner loose. Let the air escape but not return. The 4th side she left untaped, a one-way valve fashioned from MRE packaging and medical tape that cost $1.47 to replace. Rourke gasped. His chest rose. The oxygen saturation monitor climbed. 65, 71. 78, 84. Sinus rhythm holding steady. Breathing, the night nurse whispered. Of course he's breathing, Margaret said. She didn't look up. He's a Marine. That was when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. He'd been called immediately, the monitor alarms routed through the system like a silent scream. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw. Margaret Walsh, the per diem nurse he'd spent 2 days systematically dismantling, performing a procedure that required knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under conditions that would have broken ordinary people. The occlusive dressing was flawless. Military grade. His face went white. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice came out thin. Panicked. Margaret finally looked at him. Her eyes were the color of gunmetal, not angry, not afraid, just completely empty of the deference she'd been performing for 3 days. Saving his life. The chest seal you ordered for this unit was substandard. Exactly like the ones in Ramadi. Exactly like the one that failed in the field hospital when my son's team took shrapnel. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm in the adjacent bed. Caldwell's jaw tightened. His hand moved to his radio. Security. Remove this nurse from the premises. Now. The guards came in less than 90 seconds. 2 of them, young, uncomfortable, clearly confused about why they were escorting a woman who'd just saved a patient's life out of the ICU. Margaret didn't resist. She simply held her hands out so they could see she had nothing to hide, still wearing the latex gloves darkened with Rourke's blood. Caldwell followed her to the elevator, his face flushed now, the white replaced with something closer to rage. You just practiced medicine without a license. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. You accessed restricted patient records. You're finished here, Margaret. I'm calling the state board this morning. By afternoon, you'll be unemployable anywhere in healthcare. The elevator doors slid shut before she could respond. Not that she would have. Caldwell had already made his decision. She'd seen the decision crystallize the moment he realized what she was. Not a desperate nurse trying to save a patient. A trained military medical officer. A threat. By Friday afternoon, Margaret stood in the HR office on the 3rd floor. The termination letter was typed in the impersonal sans serif font that corporations used for documents that destroyed lives. Practicing beyond scope of practice. Insubordination. Unauthorized access to restricted patient information. Gross negligence. The letter was dated Thursday, 2 days after Rourke's procedure. But Margaret knew the investigation had been thorough. Caldwell had made his 3 calls that night, one to the hospital board, one to HR, and one to a contact at the VA who'd made sure her old military medical credentials were flagged as invalid. He'd done it with the precision of a man who'd had practice weaponizing institutional systems. She surrendered her badge to the security guard, the same one who'd escorted her out on Monday morning. He looked genuinely sorry, which somehow made it worse. Sympathy from strangers was its own kind of wound. Outside, Philadelphia in October was doing what Philadelphia did best in October, raining as if the sky had a personal vendetta. The kind of rain that soaked through cotton and found the spaces between bones. Margaret stood at the bus stop with a cardboard box balanced against her hip. Inside the box, the cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom" in fading letters, a gift David had bought at the hospital gift shop when he was 12 and she'd worked a double shift. The dying succulent she'd kept in her locker, the one that somehow survived despite her forgetting to water it for weeks. And the photograph. David in his dress blues, taken 3 weeks before his unit deployed to Ramadi. He was smiling at the camera the way young men smile when they believe the world is something that can be predicted, controlled, survived. A car splashed through a puddle as it passed. The dirty water soaked the front of her coat, dripping down like tears she wouldn't cry in public. Margaret didn't flinch. Didn't shift the box. Didn't blink. Just held it tighter and waited for the bus that would take her away from Sacred Heart forever. The rain hammered down like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Caldwell didn't know. What he couldn't possibly know. There were systems older and more powerful than a hospital board. Systems that had been watching Margaret Walsh's biometric signature since the moment she'd accessed Rourke's classified file with credentials that shouldn't have existed. The Pentagon Cyber Division had flagged the access 3 days ago. The FBI had been building their case against Caldwell for 18 months. And Master Chief Daniel Torres, who'd been in that Ramadi field hospital, who'd watched a major tourniquet her own stumps and keep working, had been waiting for exactly one phone call. That call was coming. But Margaret didn't know that yet. Right now she just stood in the rain at the bus stop, holding the box that contained everything she'd salvaged from the life she'd built to hide who she really was. The bus was running 17 minutes late. Typical. She waited anyway. The Pentagon's call came through at 11:02 a.m. on a Tuesday, routed directly to Sacred Heart's main switchboard while Dr. Caldwell was 17 minutes into his live broadcast titled "Patient Safety Crisis: When Unqualified Staff in Danger Lives." He'd prepared for this moment for 3 days. Designer suit. Carefully rehearsed talking points. A sympathetic news anchor who owed him favors from consulting work he'd done on a hospital governance documentary. The studio lights were warm. The coffee was terrible. The audience was still small, maybe 40,000 viewers on the hospital's YouTube channel. Then the live chat exploded. "Hold on," the anchor said, touching her earpiece. "We're getting reports that Commander James Rourke is requesting to join this broadcast via video link from his hospital room. Dr. Caldwell, do you have objections to that?" Caldwell's smile didn't waver. "Of course not. Patient perspective is valuable." The video feed flickered. Rourke appeared on the monitor behind them, shoulders elevated against hospital pillows, still in the early stages of recovery but alert. Awake. Aware. Commander Rourke, the anchor began warmly. We understand you're still recovering from. That nurse is Major Margaret Walsh. His voice cut through the pleasantries like a blade through gauze. Not a question. A statement. A command. United States Marine Corps, Major rank. Whatever this man is telling you about her credentials is a lie. Caldwell's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered near his temple. He opened his mouth. But the anchor was already reading from a document that had appeared in her hands moments earlier. The words came out slow and deliberate, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was saying. We've just received a classified file unsealed by the Pentagon. Major Margaret Walsh. Combat Surgical Operations in Ramadi, 2009 to 2011. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under fire. The camera caught Caldwell's face. The blood draining from it. The way his hands gripped the armrest like he was trying to keep himself from falling through the chair. There's more, the anchor continued. We have a caller on line 1. A SEAL team leader who served with Major Walsh. Static crackled. Then a gravelly voice, the kind that comes from a throat that's been filled with smoke and sand. I'm Gator Clayton, Team 3 Charlie Platoon. I watched Major Walsh pull my men out of a building collapse in Ramadi. The structure came down on top of us, concrete, rebar, the whole thing. She went in alone. Got 2 of my guys out. The third one was stuck. She stayed. Kept working while the building was still shifting. Lost both legs below the knee when the secondary collapse happened. Lost them saving Commander Rourke and 3 other Marines. She tourniqueted her own stumps and kept working until every Marine was stable. Then, and I'm not exaggerating, she told us to get her back to the FOB because there were more wounded incoming. That's not an unqualified nurse. That's not anything Dr. Caldwell is describing. The silence in the broadcast studio was so complete that the sound engineer had to check his levels. The camera was still on Caldwell. His face had gone the color of old medical gauze. The anchor looked directly at him. Dr. Caldwell, do you want to respond? But before he could, an FBI representative appeared on the call, and the anchor's voice became very formal. We've just confirmed that Dr. Caldwell has been under federal investigation for 18 months regarding the sale of surgical supply contracts to manufacturers with substandard equipment. The investigation found that Caldwell approved chest seals manufactured with defective polymer compounds, the same equipment that was used in the field. The same equipment that failed during combat operations in Ramadi. Specifically, the equipment failure that resulted in the death of Lieutenant David Walsh, Major Margaret Walsh's son, in 2011. The word sat in the air like blood in water. Further, the FBI representative continued, Caldwell appears to have actively suppressed Major Walsh's access to Commander Rourke's medical file specifically to prevent documentation of similar equipment failures. Emails recovered from his computer contain language suggesting he knew Major Walsh recognized the faulty equipment and he moved to isolate her before she could file an official report. Caldwell stood up. The camera caught him half rising, his expensive suit jacket catching on the chair, his hand shaking as he tried to steady himself. The anchor turned away from him with disgust so visible it needed no words. We're ending this segment, she said. The broadcast cut. The live chat erupted into thousands of messages per second. Caldwell's phone was ringing. The producer was on the headset telling him to stay seated, stay professional, but his legs didn't obey. He walked off the set while still wearing his microphone, and everyone watching heard his breathing, heard his shoes on the studio floor, heard the moment someone said, FBI agents are in the lobby. The news cycle accelerated like a defibrillator pulse. By 2 p.m., #Fire Caldwell was trending nationwide. By 3 p.m., Sacred Heart's board had suspended his medical license pending investigation. By 4 p.m., FBI agents arrived at his office with a warrant for his financial records. In the file boxes they carried out, they found everything. Emails to the supply manufacturer. Offshore account statements. A spreadsheet with staff names highlighted in red. Margaret's name appeared 17 times with a single note beside it: restrict access. Transfer or terminate. She cannot be allowed near Rourke. The hospital went into triage mode, the corporate kind, the kind where PR teams scramble and lawyers bill overtime. Sacred Heart CEO made a personal call to Margaret's disconnected cell phone. Sent 2 administrators to her apartment. She didn't answer the door. They left a card on her doormat. The card stayed there, rain-soaked and unread. But by evening, every news station in the city was running the same image: Margaret Walsh being escorted from Sacred Heart in the rain, holding a cardboard box, her badge turned in, her name cleared. Commander Rourke gave a press conference from his hospital bed. The chest tube was still in place. The bandages were fresh. But his voice was steady and his words were chosen with precision. Major Walsh saved my life twice. Once in Ramadi when the building came down. And again 48 hours ago when equipment failed, the same equipment failure that killed her son. She kept her oath when everyone else broke theirs. She did what no doctor in this hospital had the courage to do. 6 million people watched that clip. The comment section filled faster than the moderators could delete them. You fired a Silver Star recipient for saving a life. She lost both legs for her country and you escorted her out in the rain. The real crime is that she's not running this hospital. Caldwell sat in his luxury condo, the one he'd bought with kickback money, the one whose windows overlooked the Delaware River, and watched his career burn on every screen in the apartment. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Lawyers. Reporters. Former colleagues calling to say they'd never really supported him anyway. He didn't answer any of them. His wife had taken the kids to her mother's house. He didn't know if she was coming back. His attorney called with the news that collapsed him. The FBI had found evidence that he'd known the chest seals were defective when he approved them for procurement. Known. And approved them anyway. Criminal negligence. Knowing suppression of a whistleblower. Maybe even voluntary manslaughter charges connected to David Walsh's death. His hands shook as he poured a drink. 3 days ago he was department head. Respected. Connected. Now he was standing in his condo at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, watching his arrest warrant being processed. The doorbell rang at 6:24 p.m. Process server. Summons. Margaret Walsh was suing him personally for wrongful termination, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. His attorney's name was printed on the complaint, a former JAG officer who specialized in military whistleblower cases. He sat on the edge of his expensive couch in his empty apartment and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to have nothing left. To be dismantled not by loudness but by truth. To discover that the person he'd dismissed as an old nurse, the person he'd humiliated in front of his staff, the person he'd pushed into the rain with a cardboard box, was exactly who she'd claimed to be all along. He poured another drink and waited for the police. 6 months later, someone from Sacred Heart spotted him at a strip mall in suburban Philadelphia, sitting behind a folding table with stacks of supplemental insurance pamphlets. His medical license permanently revoked. His assets frozen pending the FBI's fraud case. His wife divorced and gone. He'd lost 40 pounds. When he saw the Sacred Heart employee approaching, he turned away and pretended to be busy with paperwork. Margaret Walsh walked through the main entrance of Sacred Heart Hospital on a Thursday morning in April, sunlight pouring through the glass doors like something from a painting. Staff members stopped and nodded respectfully. She was wearing her dress uniform, marine dress blues with Major's oak leaves polished to mirror shine, silver star, and bronze stars arranged with perfect precision across her chest. The hospital had settled her lawsuit, issued a public apology, and offered her a position as Director of Emergency Protocols. She'd accepted on one condition, a memorial scholarship in David's name for combat medics transitioning to civilian nursing. She walked to Commander Rourke's room. He was still there, continuing physical therapy, staying close to coordinate with the ongoing FBI investigation. She entered and closed the door quietly behind her. From her pocket, she took the single dog tag on the broken chain, David's tag, the one she'd found hidden in Rourke's belongings 3 months ago, the one that had started everything. She placed it carefully in his hand. "David would want you to have this back, Commander. You brought him home the only way you could." Rourke's eyes filled. His voice came out rough. "Mean I'm sorry I couldn't. You carried him with you." Margaret's voice was steady, the voice of someone who'd walked through fire and come out tempered steel. "That's enough." She stood. Rourke struggled to his feet, came to attention as best he could despite his injuries, and saluted. Margaret returned it, crisp and perfect, the movement of someone who'd been saluting since 2001. As she left Sacred Heart that evening, the sun breaking through Philadelphia's clouds like a benediction, she passed the folding table where Caldwell once had his office. A janitor was sweeping up. She didn't look. Just kept walking, her prosthetics clicking on the sidewalk with the rhythm of someone who's walked through worse. That weekend, Margaret visited David's grave for the first time since his funeral. She placed his dog tag on the headstone, touched the stone once, and stood in silence while the wind moved through the cemetery. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel. Like this video, leave a comment telling us what you thought happened after Margaret walked away from that grave, and let us know, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were?